Good day. This is Red Hawk coming from Spokane, Washington, and we are at the deep end. You know, we have taken a journey through the beginning of being and what maybe came before it and what the whole point of it is. We've shown how the three essential processes create life, and the three essential processes, complexity, differentiation, and semi-permeability, create consciousness, self-awareness. And here we are, self-aware. And we've been talking about the whole way of being inside this presence, inside this wonder, and what constitutes a high spirituality. And of course, what we've talked about is living in accord, moving with it. But there's another aspect of human beings, and there's this huge penchant to want to live in accord. The religions are about that. Most spiritualities are about that. But there's this whole disruptor field that's built into us. Our ability to get in our own way. And we're going to talk about that today. It's called toxicity. Toxicity, I think, is the way it's pronounced. Toxic, the toxic. You know, it's just built in. I'm not a romantic, but a realist. And trying to be honest with the human condition is not easy. There's this aspect of consciousness. We think of Eros, life reaching for itself over, but another aspect of consciousness is thanatos. It's death. It's wanting our own death, reaching for our own death. To poison ourselves, I think the whole toxic thing is a piece of this. You know, the Far Side, Larson's Far Side, he's got a great cartoon where God is creating the earth and he has a small little eyedropper and it's coming from a bottle that says jerks, and he's dripping it into his creation. You see, there's this backwash. There's a chemical place where we've woken up to it, haven't we? We know what poisons us. You don't drink certain things, it'll kill you. And if you look at food, I mean, think about the old snake oil remedies versus the whole way the field of pharmacology is controlled. And yeah, there's all the corrupt stuff, and there's toxicity in the system and all that. This week I read a book. My grandson wanted to read a book. And actually, he wants to read books all the time, which is really nice. But one of them that he wanted to read was Lorax. And I realized as I was reading it, I was doing research for this show, because it's all about the way greed and the environment are interacting. Do you know that right now, every minute, there's anywhere from 21 to 200 acres a minute of Amazon forest being cut down. So think about what's going on during this podcast alone. 200 to 600 acres of trees will be cut down in the Amazon forest. Toxicity. There are so many flavors of it. You know, when we look at medicines, we see a skull and crossbones, we know it's poison. We don't always know when we soil our own nest. It's taken us a long time. You know, the whole climate change, the whole pollution issue of our rivers and our oceans and our air. We have to admit, and this has been the difficult thing in my study this week, I have to admit that an aspect of the human condition is clearly to be toxic. And, you know, we're learning about it. We've detoxed our food with regulations, our medicines with regulations. We've sought to, what did Martin Luther King Jr. say? The laws can't make you love me, but they can keep you from killing me. We've learned whole ways of not killing ourselves. And now we're learning to detox the planet. We're slowly becoming aware of the toxic forces that are at play in the environment that we put there, and we didn't know at the time they were doing that. But also there are toxic forces in the workplace, and this is what amazes me, how this toxic aspect of the human condition seems to get into everything, and I mean everything. And when it gets into our relationships, well, wow. Talk about poisoning an environment. And I'm sure most people, if you've gotten to 35, you've seen toxic relationships in the workplace, in the community. And one of my goals today is to see the toxic more clearly, and to learn and be a creative force in cutting it off at the pass, if you will. And to realize that this is not some other thing. This is part of us. This is part of the shadow aspect. This is part of Thanatos running around inside us, seeking to have his way as well, which is death. But naming it in our relationships, in our environment, and then seeking to do something about it, I think that's a huge piece of our spiritual journey. So that's where I want us to start today. Toxicity. How do we deal with it? What is it? What say you? Bob, we'll start with you. What say you, bro?
Well, like most of the things we discussed at the deep end, it's a very complex issue. So many things can bring toxicity into any environment, whether it's an excess of something or a lack of something or an interaction with someone or something that is not good for us. The idea that greed can become toxic if it's pushed so far. I think that good works can become toxic if they're pushed too far. And all of these, dare I say it, they all relate to a lack of balance. And when we find ourselves engaging in some sort of activity that is toxic to us, we need to stop and pull back, because it's very difficult. One of the things that humans have a big problem with is short-term versus long-term goals. Long-term goals just kind of elude us. Short-term goals we can kind of get a handle on, and short-term rewards are sort of what drive us. But we have to begin to realize that as those short-term rewards build up, they can lead us into a toxic environment. So it's very complicated, but it always gets back to self-awareness and being willing to stop and look at what's really going on.
Yeah. And you listen to Bob Hayes. He's coming from Florida. And Marianne Rudis is coming from Spokane Valley. So, Marianne, what say you on this toxicity? Although the whole thing sucks.
Well, I think just recognizing that there are harmful things in our environment, and there are harmful things that we do to ourselves within our environment that create toxicity, because it's when I think of it, I think of disharmony. So it puts us, Bob, I love your balance. It puts us out of balance, right? And excesses can become toxic. And I just think that the idea of long-term versus short-term, you talked about the Amazon forest, the Amazon forest has been called the lungs of our planet. And so if we are cutting out our lungs, what does that do long-term? In the short term, somebody's going to make a profit and someone's going to live well. But in the long term, and I think that having people in our world that can have a long-term vision and sound those alarms and speak to that, but it's hard to cut through when you have others who just don't want to see that or don't want to go there. And so the idea of these toxic relationships, these fights that we have with each other, where we've got competing goals, we've got competing interests. At what point does it become toxic? And at what point is it, like you said, just part of the human condition and something that we have to live with and work out. The idea that I think we can have arguments and discussions and different opinions without that being a toxic environment. I think it becomes toxic when it becomes harmful, when it becomes hurtful, either to ourselves or to someone else.
And that's part of what the whole skull and crossbones is. There's a point where you cross a line. We know how many parts per million of this element or that element is okay before it becomes toxic, and how that works. We learned about lead and how it became toxic and maybe even influenced the thinking of Roman people. Over and over, we're learning a greater sensitivity to what toxicity is. I think in my heart, and part of the whole deep end is us basically saying, the three of us, WTF, about a lot of things, just thinking about it and not trying to sell a perspective, but just how do we engage this? And as a realist, I have to see that this toxic element of the human condition is maybe it's an aspect of the shadow. I don't know, and it's something like that. The shadow and Thanatos get together and they conspire to muddle the water and create disruptor fields to make the simplest thing difficult.
Well, I think you brought up a really important piece of this, and it's the cumulative effect of how things kind of add up. That and realizing that we have our own contribution, and how do we manage that? How do we mitigate our own contribution to the toxicity in the world?
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to jump.
No, good. I was just going to say that a very frustrating thing is that a lot of people who are in toxic relationships, they are willing to continue in that relationship for any number of reasons that seem good to them, or that maybe is coming up for them from their unconscious. But we see it all the time in abusive households, where a man or a woman will abuse their spouse, and then the spouse will refuse to testify against them because they're more comfortable staying in that relationship than what they fear might happen if their spouse is arrested or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that just defines a toxic relationship, what you just defined. And before we go any further, go ahead, Bob. Make it quick, though, because there's some things I want to cover.
Yeah, but we can know we're in a toxic relationship, and we can make the decision that we're going to stay in it rather than try and get out of it. And
I have to disagree, because I've been in the middle of those. I actually had surgery because I got beat up in the middle of one of those. And those choices are not easily made. What's happening there is people are awash in unconscious forces. And although it might seem like a choice to you, it really is not. And that's part of the whole issue in domestic violence, is coming to awareness. So let's look at what a toxic relationship is. And I'm going to verywellmind.com. A toxic relationship is one that makes you feel unsupported, misunderstood, demeaned, or attacked. A relationship is toxic when your well-being is threatened in some way, emotionally, psychologically, and even physically. On basic level, any relation that makes you feel worse than better can become toxic over time. And then signs of a toxic relationship: you give more than you're getting, which makes you feel devalued and depleted. You feel consistently disrespected, or that your needs aren't being met. You feel a toll on your self-esteem over time. You feel unsupported, misunderstood, demeaned. Minimizing is a huge piece of domestic violence. You feel depressed, angry, or tired after speaking or being with the other person. You bring out the worst in each other. You are not your best self around that person. You feel like you have to walk on eggshells around this person. You spend a lot of time and emotional strength trying to cheer them up. and you are always to blame. And these are just a few things. We can get into toxic versus abusive relationships, and how that works, especially, the closest thing I've seen in domestic violence regarding choice is the Stockholm syndrome. Which is you start bonding with your captor, if you will. But I think go ahead, Marianne.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was just going to say, I think that what you just described, it really speaks to the complexity that these are not simple things. There are so many forces at work, and I always come back to ourselves. So when you are in these kind of relationships, when you feel demeaned, when you feel all these things, there's a core, a center within ourselves that believes that as well. And it's not just what we're taking from someone else. And so how do you heal that? I think that's, anyway, that's my...
When you put another layer of complexity over that, and that's the fact that society does not provide opportunities for people to get out of toxic relationships. They're not programs that allow for a safe transition. There are, someone goes into a police department and reports something, and quite often the blame is cast on them. Well, what did you do to bring this on? Or the person who is interviewing them is in some sort of a problematic relationship themselves, and they suddenly start projecting that onto this person. So there's all of these layers of complexity that we have to look at anytime we're trying to get out of a toxic situation.
And I think sometimes before we can get out of it, we have to see it. And that's the huge piece that I've seen over and over. Toxic behavior, here's just some little flags, if you will. Insecure, jealous, negative, self-centered, selfish, critical, demeaning, distrusting, abusive, disrespectful. And you can go to, I think it's the YMCA or the YWCA, I can't remember. They have what's called an abuse wheel. And that gives, minimizing. There's a whole spectrum of ways that we can identify toxic behavior. And here's the thing. Once you start seeing it, my wife ran domestic violence shelters for years, and the whole concept of once somebody sees it, then to have an option to do something about it. And that doesn't just go for our toxic relationships in our everyday life. That goes through our relationship with the planet. I think about how quickly recycling happened in America. I mean, within 10 years, everybody was recycling. I hope.
The problem is that the institutions that we've established to take care of recycling are now just throwing it all into the landfill. The good ideas are great until they're executed.
Well, what are they throwing? They separate it first, and the stuff that's will decompose goes into the landfill. And I'm sure
the latest studies are that they just throw it all in there. They don't even bother.
Yeah. See, Washington State is very, very different from Florida. Obviously, we don't do that.
Well, it's not just Florida. Florida is probably leading the pack of the worst, but it's all over the country. And I bet you can find pockets of greedy people in the state of Washington who are making money off of pretending to recycle.
Well, I happen to have just buried the guy who started recycling here in town, built a whole industry of it, helped start 2 banks. And I can only say that here in Spokane, it's very, very solid, and, how they're doing it, and I know how they're doing it. Now, again, I'm thankful I live in Washington State because there's a moral sense of the organic here in this state. But I think you just put your finger on an order of the toxic. The Lorax brings it out. It's greed, it's selfishness, it's self-centeredness. It's not able to think in terms of the community. My daughter never took a government class in high school. She never was required a civics class, and that's the class that changed me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Well, the idea that we have a hand in our communities, right? And that we have an obligation to have a hand in our communities. And these toxic relationships, we haven't really talked about the ripple effect of those things, and how they permeate out. My thoughts go to children. I mean, children that are raised in these environments, and all of us living on the planet, watching what's happening. We're destroying things, and we're children of the planet. And what are we doing to ourselves? And how can we step up, like you said, get civically engaged to try and make it less toxic, I guess.
As you're talking, a recurring question comes to me over and over about the human family. Are we narcissists or sociopaths? I shouldn't laugh at that.
We're narcissistic sociopaths. There we go.
But, there's a disconnect. And it seems to me our time is trying to reconceive the connect in a way that we haven't really engaged in since pre-civilization. Which is when we were an organic people. And I'm not suggesting we return to that, but I'm suggesting there's a sensuous sensibility of receptivity to the whole and the complete picture. And our narratives are trying to catch up to that, to allow us access to that awareness, that perceptual integrity, if you will, that we might... and that's back to be here now, is how do I receive this moment? How do I realize that these senses are openings that let the other in? And the other is in all directions. And in that receptive moment, that is holy in my mind.
I agree. But getting back to what the practical side of things, how do we begin to recognize what is toxic and what actions we can take? I mean, I'm down here in Florida in the center of toxicity. Marianne, you just mentioned we got to think about children. Well, that's what toxic politicians use as a wedge to gather power. And here in Florida, we've got a toxic administration that is using the idea that schools are harming our children to take control of the schools and change the curricula and eliminate the study of certain aspects of history, for example. All with the idea, we're going to protect our children.
See,
in fact, that's a toxic act that's harming our children.
And that's the nature of toxicity. And I think it's important, in a song I wrote, every generation has its own iteration where the dark comes into play with the light. And that's there's a whole new iteration of power and greed and money. And the American dream means getting all these things and being in control. And that's just an aspect of toxicity. And what I want us to see, and this is so important, and you all were touching on it, the effects. It vectors out. And that's part of what you're saying, Bob, because as that poison enters the system and ends up creating a more narrow bandwidth of perception that's basically white, powerful versus the peasants, if you will, giving the peasants meaning, then that's a new flavor. And yet it's the same stuff that everybody from Rockefeller to Carnegie, to all those power people, J.P. Morgan, they were all doing the same thing. The Hearst newspaper empire. If you look at the beginning, when Washington became the first president, Jefferson started a newspaper that was basically dissing Washington. So it's the point I want us to see, and we can go in any direction and see this is toxic and show how it happens in all these different ways. But the point of this podcast is to show that it's part of our human nature and that it's not just out there. It's part of who we are, just as much as the shadow and Thanatos are part of every person's consciousness. So is this an aspect of it. And, if we're honest, we can start seeing how we sabotage ourselves. We can see how we fail to go with the flow of a certain meeting or this or that, and go, maybe I was the toxic person in that situation. And I have to say, for a lot of people, I was. I have a folder almost an inch thick of all the things wrong with me. Well, actually, they missed a few. But this whole concept of being toxic and it being part of us, I want us to be able to see it more clearly out there in the environment, in our chemistry, in our relationships, and in ourselves. And that's where the final ball lands, if I might say that.
Well, and honestly, I kind of think that I don't know that it's part of our nature to be toxic. I think it's when we miss our true nature that we can become toxic. I think we can have disagreements and arguments, and we can speak out against what someone else is doing without being toxic, because it's actually, to me, toxicity is something that harms. And if our intent is to heal and to help, we may get into heated arguments over how to do that. But when we start to harm another, or we start to harm our planet, when we start to harm our children, when we start to harm things, then I think that's where the toxicity comes in. And to me, that is when we are missing what we should be doing.
Yeah, and I'm going to let that be your final comments because we're at the end of our time. But I will say that I like that we get caught up in the backwash of missing the mark, if you will. And I think that's very helpful for me. Bob, final comments?
Well, I appreciate your optimism, Marianne, and I agree with you from a certain point. But I think we got to realize that toxicity, to paraphrase a definition of beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. Well, you may think you're doing a lot of good, but somebody else may think you're very toxic. And it's so complicated. And you know what they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And we have to be very, very careful. We have to be able to step back and really look at the situation before we act, or be willing to stop certain actions if we can step back and see that they're leading to something that's toxic. And it may not be toxic to us, and we may not see it for 10 years or 100 years or 500 years. But still, there's all of these interactions happening, and they're so complicated that maybe this is what you're getting at, Red Hawk. Toxicity is going to be part of it because it's part of the way humans, imperfect as we are, interact with one another.
Amen. And here's the thing, my final comment, is it seems to me this aspect of us keeps showing up, and we need to just create more sensitive loops to see it sooner and sooner in its process, that it doesn't cause harm. So, as we were talking today, I started thinking about this mouse that they threw into some water, and right before it drowned, they saved it. And then a week later, they took that mouse with a bunch of mice that had never been put in water and put them all in together. And the mouse that had been saved previously swam twice as long as the other mice. Hope. Being saved the first time, it created hope. So what is our hope for tomorrow? You know, they say the last spirit that left Pandora's box after the plague and toxicity and all the other, fiendish thingies that are in life was hope. Hope was the last one. Was that a curse or was that a blessing? What is hope? We've talked about hope before, but it's been a while, and I'll be honest. In spite of everything, I'm hopeful. I'm not hopeful within my lifetime, but I'm hopeful for the human family because we're stupid, but we do learn. We do learn. And I have to say, the toxic state of affairs, the more sensitive we become, the more we learn about who we are, how we are, and what we've been. And my friends, that is hopeful. Till next podcast, blessings, and may the one of grace be all over you.